Peter, when you mentioned the comment letters, one of the things that we talk about often at our board meetings, we send out these joint letters, but we always do talk about whether or not having letters coming from the members themselves, even if it's a stock letter, you know, does that help? And I was always of the opinion from way back when I worked in Washington that volume mattered as well as the letter from the people at the top of the organization. So you think the volume matters?
Yes, I do. I think it's an excellent point. Volume matters more in terms of legislation because the members of Congress in the House are up for re-election every 2 years, in the Senate every 6 years. And so when I worked up on the Hill, we used to joke that instead of reading the letters that came in, at that time it was mainly hard copies and not electronic, we would just weigh the stuff and not even read the contents of the letters. Whichever weighed more on one side or the other, that's the side we would support.
I had a similar job. It was my job to count the letters.
Yeah.
And if a letter had a petition and had 100 signatures, still only counted as a letter. So
right.
Well, that's what.
Right, but clearly, even though the volume of mail isn't as important for regulators as it is for members of Congress, it still is important because it demonstrates kind of widespread grassroots interest in a subject matter and deciding one way versus another way. And one of the things I suppose that we need to focus more on is not just writing a smart comment letter. That's important. If we've got the merits on our side, and we usually do, articulating the merits is an important thing. But generating grassroots mail, even if, as you say, they're kind of form letters, does demonstrate that the individual members do care about this, and that's not lost on the regulators. They will pay attention to those
and
things.
It's worth mentioning here that one of the things that ASA at least is bringing online in the next few months is the capacity in an online space for our members to go out and engage in that type of grassroots advocacy. And obviously down the road it's something that, as our relationship continues to develop, will make a lot of sense to say, hey, if we can get both ASA and NAIFA members motivated and energized in sending these letters in. And the beauty of the modern platforms is that you can really target it. Like, let's say you've got a bill and you've got a member of Congress from Ohio who's introduced it and you want to support it and say, hey, go you, or you say, hey, it's a bad idea. And you can drill down to a level of detail in who you want to have sending that and really get the constituent base motivated, not just your members, en masse, which is important, but really get the right constituents
Ohio, right from
that district. And that's really one of the great things about tools like that is it allows you to get the constituent voices in the door as well and have those really stand out prominently. And so hopefully, our implementation process will be done in the next few months and we'll be done and through with proof of concept. And once it's settled, hopefully we'll be able to say, hey, we've got it for the ASAs, and fingers crossed, write your member of your board of directors. If it works well, then hopefully we can expand that across to NAIFA and really, give both memberships the opportunity to leverage the strength of that platform.
Sounds like a great idea.
Yeah, and one of the things we talk about here in terms of trying to plan government relations strategy is how much or how little do we know about our own members and about relationships that they may have with elected members of Congress or even members of state legislatures. And every once in a while, you stumble across the fact that, one of our members in Minnesota or Texas or somewhere, his or her cousin is a member of Congress. Or you find out that some of our members have in fact made political contributions to members of Congress that we don't know anything about. So they have these relationships that oftentimes we don't know about. But if we did know, and we should know, it could be very helpful in winning an argument on a particular issue. So one of the things that we're trying to do in ASA is to build a database that tells us much more about our members' interests and their connections their interest in politics, their interest in subject matter, because very often, you know, bringing a constituent in to a meeting on Capitol Hill, and these members also go back to their districts regularly. Sometimes having a meeting with the congressman in their district offices is better than bringing somebody from the district to Washington to meet with them. So this is something that I think we all need to do, is to build better databases which will give us more information about how we can call on our members to express the kind of grassroots passion and interest that they have. And I think, again, as I said at the top of this discussion, appraisers are among the most regulated professions in the country. And the financial and professional well-being really depends on our getting in there, being able to meet with members of Congress, meet with members of state legislatures, meet with regulators, you know, to make our case. So that's something that we're trying to do. Now, we've talked, of course, about the bank regulatory agencies in terms of Dodd-Frank. We've talked about the fact that there are still some important regulatory proposals to implement Dodd-Frank that have to come down the pike that are important to each of our members. There are other things going on at the federal level of government where we've also worked jointly, ASA and NAIFA, and one of those things has to do with the IRS. For those of our members, your members, who do tax-related work, maybe they value properties in connection with estates or gifts. Maybe they do similar kind of work that somebody takes and includes on a tax return. IRS, of course, not too long ago, established requirements on what constitutes a qualified appraiser and what constitutes a qualified appraisal for tax purposes. And I think we won some pretty significant victories in that regard. Another item that implicates our members with respect to IRS is tax return preparers. And who's a tax return preparer? Is an appraiser who prepares an appraisal for an estate or a gift tax matter a tax return preparer? Do they have to register with the IRS? You know, IRS concluded, and I think correctly so, that a lot of the tax avoidance or the tax people who file tax returns, and maybe they don't do it exactly the right way, a lot of that comes from professional tax return preparers. So IRS has tried to get a better handle on who's a tax return preparer. And frankly, in some cases, an appraiser can be a tax return preparer, what they call a non-signing tax return preparer. Why? Because they've prepared a document that's important to a taxpayer's tax liability. And so an issue that we've been spending a good deal of time on is that particular issue. Under what circumstances can an appraiser be a tax return preparer? And what kind of tax return preparer are they? Because under this new IRS regime, people who are paid tax return preparers have to pass an exam and have to engage in continuing education. Well, wait a minute. We don't want that. We don't want that for our appraisers, even though they do prepare appraisals in connection with the filing of a tax return. So we're in this kind of very sensitive and important dance now with the IRS, which wants to include everybody who touches a tax return as a tax return preparer to be regulated by IRS, versus those people who do things that are important to the outcome of a tax return, but shouldn't be lumped in with these people who have to take an exam and have to engage in continuing education.
Well, I'm glad you're the one doing the lobbying with the IRS and not me. I actually once had to do an appraisal for the IRS, and they made me, it was like a 13-page contract, and it was really draconian. There was all these things where I was going to get penalized and fined and garnished, and I was working for them. I mean, it wasn't like I was working, and it was all confidential. I mean, just unbelievable.
Yes.
About a year and a half later, I got a call from the IRS. They wanted to hire me to do an appraisal, and they asked me what job I previously worked on for them, and I told them I wasn't allowed to tell them because it was confidential.
That's funny.
They didn't laugh.
Oh, okay.
It was like, it was just dead silence, and I was like, maybe I don't want this job.
Well, yeah, they, one thing that IRS does very well, in fact, maybe on occasion they do it too well, is protecting, you know, taxpayer privacy. So even though you had already done this, you had certain requirements, 6103 of the Internal Revenue Code, which says you're banned from the country if you disclose certain taxpayer information and that sort of thing.